This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 597 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We had some decent hits on last week's Sleeper Show. Taysom Hill was a strong play, KJ Osborne had that big play to save his day, Deontay Foreman was a top 15 running back, Gerald Everett scored, Ben Roethlisberger was a QB1, and Austin Hooper had a good day. Now on the bad side, Tyler Conklin didn't do a whole lot. Jamison Crowder stunk. And each of the deep sleepers ended up not hitting. But there was more good than bad on last week's show. That's always a win with this type of format. Now that the stakes are higher with it being the fantasy football playoffs, let's keep it rolling. Before getting into the sleepers this week, I've got a question for you. What better way to gear up for the weekend than to spice up your thirsty Thursday night football with FanDuel and Captain Morgan? Introducing Captain Morgan's Thursday Night Pick'em, a completely free-to-play contest series that gives you 4 chances to win a share of $10,000. Here's how it works. FanDuel fans will have the chance to answer 10 questions centered around both Captain Morgan and that Thursday night's NFL matchup. Fans who answer the most questions correctly will be eligible to earn their share of the week's $10,000 cash prize. Thursday Night Football will kick off before you know it, so head to FanDuel.com/CaptainMorganNFL and spice up your game day today. Must be 21 years or older to participate. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. And don't forget to spice up your game day with Captain Morgan. Let's kick things off with a few players in this new tier that I started last week, or players rostered in 50 to 70% of Yahoo leagues. The Steelers' rush defense has been bad, and that's being nice. They've given up the third most rushing yards to running backs this season, and they're first in rushing yards allowed over the last 5 weeks. They get Tennessee this week. Tennessee's a team that continues to run the football despite Derrick Henry being sidelined. They're 5th lowest in the league in neutral script pass rate, and they've had more pass attempts than rush attempts in just one of their last 4 games. That means Deontay Foreman, who's seen 19 and 13 rush attempts over his last 2, that means that he's in play this week. I'll give you a 2-for-1 with this next one, and that's Christian Kirk and AJ Green. Green is technically rostered in fewer than 50% of leagues, but Kirk is rostered in 65%. DeAndre Hopkins is banged up, and it's been reported that he could miss the rest of the regular season. Both Green and Kirk are really solid plays moving forward as a result. They get Detroit this week, and the Lions as a matchup for wide receivers hasn't really been a cakewalk. But we could very easily see 20% plus target shares for both wide receivers. Kirk in particular could see a nice bump, because in 2 of his 3 games without Hopkins this year, he saw his 2 highest snap rates of the season. Both guys need to be rostered moving forward, and you could consider starting them this week. And then another player who didn't practice on Wednesday was Devontae Parker, but it was evidently a veteran rest day. I don't mind Parker this week. He's got a plus matchup against the Jets, who rank 14th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and Parker's averaged over 67 receiving yards per game this year in games where Tua Tagovailoa has started. He's at a 21% target share in 3 of those 4 games. That's enough for me to see him as a worthy flex option if you need it. Moving on, this tier is all about players rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And let's just get right back to the guy that I just talked about, and that's Tua Tagovailoa. The Jets rank 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season. Tua has played 2.5 games against teams ranked in the top 5 in adjusted fantasy points allowed. He scored 26.5 points against Atlanta. He came in against Baltimore. He played 1/2 against them and scored 12 fantasy points. And then he scored 17.5 against the same Jets team in week 11. It's a good matchup for him, and he's been solid enough this year, especially in these plus matchups. Now, I brought up Jimmy Garoppolo in the 15 transaction show, and I obviously like him this week as well. I think I prefer Jimmy G to Tua. He scored 15 or more fantasy points in 6 of his last 7. The 49ers have a huge implied team total over 27 points according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and Atlanta is the top opponent for a quarterback in adjusted fantasy points allowed. That means that Jimmy G makes a ton of sense. Moving on, let's talk about KJ Osborne. He ended up with 125 air yards last week, and he had a 29% target share in this Minnesota offense. The Vikings get the Bears this week, and Chicago's been average against wide receivers in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they continue to rank in the top 5 in 15-plus air yard completion rate allowed. So maybe Osborne's able to get another big play this week. Jamison Crowder burned some of us last week, both in season long and in DFS. But as I alluded to on the 15 transaction show, he's in a good spot here in week 15. He didn't see the most targets among Jets receivers last week, with Braxton Berrios taking that award home, but according to PFF, Crowder ran twice as many routes as Berrios did, and he played 82% of his snaps from his typical slot location. That's good for this matchup, because Miami has been bad against slot guys all season long. They rank first in the league in target share allowed to that area of the field, and they're one of the worst teams in raw targets, receptions, and yards allowed to the slot as well. So I like Crowder in week 15. We'll have to see if J.D. McKissic ends up going this week, but I don't mind him if he does, at least in PPR formats. He's seen a double-digit percentage target share in all but 2 games this year. That's 9 out of 11 games. He's averaging a target share per game of about 14%. Philadelphia, his opponent, they're not a bad opponent. They rank 12th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. And they're also 9th in adjusted target share allowed to the position. So if he goes, I think that McKissic is a nice high floor PPR option. And then it sounds like the Texans' backfield is going to come down to David Johnson and Royce Freeman this weekend. Johnson is part of this tier from a percent rostered standpoint, where Freeman is more of a deeper sleeper because of his rostered number. It's tough to typically trust the Texans' backfield, but I'm sure some of you are in desperate need of running back help. And they're only 3.5-point underdogs this week against Jacksonville. And Jacksonville's a team that ranks as an above average matchup. Now, I will say a lot of that with Jacksonville has to do with game script. So for a guy like Royce Freeman to hit, I'd argue that you need Houston to jump out to a lead. And that's a little bit risky. I mean, using a Texans running back is risky to begin with. But I'm saying this because I think that I would trust Johnson more than Freeman because of his pass catching potential. In this next tier of players rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, I've got my top streaming choice this week at quarterback, and that's Justin Fields. The Vikings are a good opponent for quarterbacks. They've allowed the 5th most adjusted fantasy points to the position. But more importantly, Justin Fields is running more. That's the key here. Fields is averaging 9 rush attempts and 74 rushing yards per game over his last 3. That's almost 2 additional passing touchdowns per game from a fantasy standpoint. And that doesn't even account for potential rushing touchdowns. That's allowed him to score 18 plus fantasy points in each one of those games. The matchup, the rushing, it's all coming together for Justin Fields this week. Gabriel Davis should get a lot more run now that Emmanuel Sanders is looking unlikely to play in week 15. Davis saw about 16% of Buffalo's targets in week 14 while playing a season-high 83% snap rate. He's also tied for the league lead in red zone targets over the last 2 weeks. Now, Carolina's not the best matchup in the world, but if he can get to a 15 to 20% target share in this Buffalo offense, I think that he should be in good shape. Now, I'll be honest, there really weren't a ton of players in this tier to go to this week, especially with me not having the ability to know how injuries are going to just shake out. But I do have one more for you in this tier, and that's Donovan Peoples-Jones. Austin Hooper and Jarvis Landry landed on the COVID list, and that's on top of having a thin depth chart. And Baker tested positive too. The matchup for DPJ is not great, but the Browns at least shouldn't see a massive drop-off at the quarterback position with Case Keenum. And Peoples-Jones could be fed simply due to lack of alternatives. This really isn't a too many mouths to feed type argument either. Peoples-Jones is good. He can earn targets. But the Browns really lack alternatives in that offense right now. So Peoples-Jones should be able to walk away from week 15 with a lot of looks, a lot of targets. And that's all we can really ask for in fantasy football. Now, this final tier consists of players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues that you could consider starting. And Allen Lazard is one of them. I actually think that of the 3 players that I'm talking about in this tier this week, Lazard makes the most sense. I like him the most. Without Randall Cobb and his 9 to 10% target share in week 14, Lazard saw a 20% target share. That was the second highest single game share of the season. And he also scored 20.9 PPR points, his highest output of the year. According to PFF, Randall Cobb has played about 77% of his snaps from the slot this season. In week 14, Lazard led the Packers with a 53% slot snap rate. That number was 37% for Lazard prior to week 14. He saw 4 of his 7 targets against Chicago from that area of the field, and he had 58 yards and a touchdown. Now the Packers get Baltimore this week, a team with a struggling secondary. So yes, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, he makes sense too. But Lazard is the guy who has very, very low percent rostered numbers right now. He's out there in a ton of leagues. I'm going to call out Jordan Howard in this tier as well. And I'm doing what I sort of did last week with Sony Michel. I think we should expect Miles Sanders to be the lead back for Philadelphia. But number one, he's having ankle issues. Number two, the Eagles were giving Jordan Howard a decent number of touches before his own knee injury. He even hit a 59% running back rush share in week 9 against the Chargers, running the ball 17 times. Now, I doubt that Howard just takes over this backfield. So it's not totally like Sony Michel from that perspective, because I think that Michel could still do that. But the Eagles have been extremely run heavy since week 8. They're averaging a pass rate of about 35% per game since that point in time. So even in a part-time role in a game where the Eagles are favorites, Howard could work as a deep sleeper. And lastly, I'm going to go to James O'Shaughnessy. Full disclosure, tight end streaming is beyond terrible this week. It's awful. But even though the Jags' passing attack is miserable, O'Shaughnessy may be able to give you some cheap PPR points. He's seen a 19% target share per game over his last 2, and he's tied for the team lead in targets during this time. Jacksonville's opponent, Houston, they rank as the 4th best matchup for the position in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Again, just to reiterate, it's really tough for tight ends this week. O'Shaughnessy could pay off, though. Now, as for the defensive streamers, I talked about Philly earlier this week, and they definitely work. And I also don't mind Cincinnati against Denver or Minnesota against Chicago. But they're not in ideal spots. And honestly, I think that you could go for the Jags. They're home favorites against the Texans, and according to FanDuel Sportsbook, that game has just a 39.5 point over-under. So you could get a floor from the Jags defense just in the points allowed department. But the Jaguars defense isn't like an abomination, at least their front isn't. They actually rank in the top half of the league in pressure rate this year. It's one of the few matchups where you could consider them. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.